Welcome back to another episode of the Care2Listen podcast. In this episode, I am joined by Jonathan Orr, a Provincial crisis intervention specialist. Jonathan opens up about his personal experiences with addiction and shares how he has used his own experience to support others and influence positive change. Today's episode is being broadcasted to you on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Trigger warning. This episode discusses topics that may be triggering for some viewers, including addiction, suicide, and trauma. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Care2Listen podcast. Today, joining me on the show is our special guest, Jonathan Orr. Jonathan is a crisis intervention specialist with the Mobile Overdose Response Team. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Let's just start off with a little bit about getting to know who you are. You're somebody who has so much experience when it comes to talking about overdose awareness, overdose response, and in general, just understanding what's going on right now with the toxic drug supply. And so I'm curious, like, before we get into that and your current work experience, let's get to know you.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting word, right? Understanding. And, I think the most profound understandings come from having lived experience of something. And so those kinds of experiences live in us in a different kind of way than, say, academic learning might or on-the-job training might. They live in our whole selves, like they become physical parts of us. And for me, what that lived experience looks like is that I'm someone that has lived with a substance use disorder diagnosis. And so that manifested itself for me in very serious struggles with addiction, especially 12 years ago. I've been sober for about 12 years, but prior to that, it was all consuming and really intense. And what happened for me was that those struggles with addiction really brought me to my knees and forced me to reach out for various kinds of help. And I ended up in residential treatment in 2011 at Pacifica, not far down the road here, actually, just off Commercial Drive. And so that experience was transformative. It was difficult, of course. It's not an easy thing to go through, but it really did change me in a pretty profound way. And one of the simple ways that it changed me was accepting and kind of embracing my own humanity, but also the need for other people, the need for help, the need for community, the need for connection, and that being a human being is hard enough without help, but being a human being that's struggling with significant mental health issues on your own is very difficult. And so coming out of that, it was clear to me that I needed to maintain those connections and that sense of community, and also to, try and turn that trauma, and let's be clear, it wasn't just the trauma I experienced, but the trauma I inflicted on others, my family, my friends, my community, to turn that trauma and what was a negative thing into perhaps something useful. And so after Pacific, I ended up living at the Belkin House, the Salvation Army downtown. That was a difficult experience. I remember it was hard, going to live there at first, and I remember resisting. And the thing that I was focused on was that the rooms they had available had linoleum floors, and I was like, nope, not going. Yeah, I'm not going there. I hate the floors, and it's that kind of thing that can really like catch you up, and you get like, no, it's that detail that's going to block me, because your addiction and your fears and all that stuff comes up, and you look for ways to not do that thing that's good for you. But I pushed through that, and one of the things that was offered to me at Salvation Army, so many powerful things there, but one of the things was that they had a transitional housing program that was actually run by the Portland Hotel Society. It was called Addiction Supported Independent Living, a really powerful program that sadly doesn't exist anymore. And what it was, you were assigned 2 workers from Portland Hotel Society who would assist you in getting housing, which, man, that's a traumatizing experience, right? Especially for somebody new in recovery and just kind of learning how to be a person in the world. And you can imagine what that's like, going to like interview for housing, and they're like, well, what do you do right now?
Yeah.
I live at the Salvation Army. It's difficult. It's, humbling and hard. And so this team and this program was there to help you with that. And again, those human beings, those connections that were like there to support you in that. But in that support, as they helped me through that process, I kept asking questions about what they did. What was Portland Hotel Society about? I knew a little bit because I'd lived in and around Vancouver for a long time. I knew about Insight, for example. And then I just was like, that's what I want to do. That just came to me, and I was like, I want your help I want to go work at PHS. And I didn't want to work anywhere. I didn't want to work in the hotels necessarily. I didn't want to do housing. I wanted to work at Insight. I really wanted to work with people who were going through and had been through something similar to me. And so they were amazing people, and they helped me do that. And so I applied, and I think I was pretty annoying. I was like, you needed certain hours before you could work at Insight. And I kept hassling the manager, Darwin Fisher, who was an amazing human being as well. And finally, he just kind of gave in. He's like, okay, come down and do your training. And so, yeah. And so I went to work at Insight in, I guess it was 2013 or somewhere around 2012, 2013, around there, and worked at Insight for a few years. And I was still working at Insight when the drug toxicity crisis first hit. And that experience was, it was very sudden. It was literally like 2 weeks before we would, at Insight, you'd have like one overdose a week. Right. Usually mild, usually in the injection room, usually supported by doctors and, nurses that were there, really clear protocols, and usually never any significant issues because everyone was so well trained. Within weeks, we were responding to overdoses of people almost dropping in traffic, almost getting run over by buses, people on sidewalks, behind dumpsters, in stairwells. And when I say people, it wasn't necessarily just, people that lived in the downtown east side that maybe, that typical stereotypical view of somebody struggling with substance use. We were reviving construction workers on the way to build condos. We were reviving bus drivers. We were reviving young people, Indigenous people, everybody all of a sudden. And it was really intense. And so it escalated really quickly, and then it became part of the news cycle. And, what is this? What do we do? And we started learning about fentanyl it became apparent very quickly that the tools we had before weren't going to work. Like a safe injection site, us staying in that site wasn't going to work when people were passing out and overdosing all around us. We had to be able to respond quickly and in a different way. And so one of the things that happened was that the province reached out to PHS and said, what are we going to do? We need to do something different. This is a crisis. It requires a new kind of response. And so PHS said, we have these spaces where we can set up what are called overdose prevention sites, which was a brand new idea. Sarah Blythe was one of the first to do this. And so what made those distinct was that they, because we needed to respond quickly and couldn't necessarily get doctors and nurses and all that infrastructure in place, the radical idea was to have folks from the community be part of those spaces, work in those spaces. So, it's a banal kind of phrase, members of the community. Let me be really clear what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about active substance users from the community. I'm talking about people that were maybe engaged in sex work. I'm talking about those folks that were already on the front lines in their own community, bringing their knowledge and experience of that community and those problems, and creating these powerful sites, right? And we really talked about radical kindness. Everyone was welcome. We didn't bar people. We didn't ban people. Perhaps you were somebody at Insight who couldn't access Insight. A lot of people at Insight were at least presented as dangerous. Were in psychosis or, maybe sometimes carried weapons. We let everybody in. And we were guided in, again, let me be clear, that we were guided in this by members of the community that knew these folks and knew that a lot of that stuff is trauma response. You know,
Right.
when somebody arrives at your site and they're agitated and they're aggressive with you, that's not about you. They've already been traumatized a dozen times before they arrived there. In the store they went in to buy their breakfast, on the bus, by police. They've already arrived there with all that trauma. And we learned that radical kindness from so many powerful, what we ended up calling peer support workers there, who brought that lived experience and that real, authentic patience and kindness. And so we set those up really quickly. And, the first one that opened was the Maple Overdose Prevention site. And I think we opened it within 48 hours of being asked by the province. And so I moved from Insight to there to do that work. And, at those days we were responding over a shift. We were responding to, 25 to 30 overdoses
Wow.
per shift. And again, we're now fast forward, and overdose prevention sites are the most common intervention in the overdose crisis, not just in Vancouver and British Columbia, but across Canada and North America. Peer-staffed overdose prevention sites are now the primary response. But it's worthwhile stepping back and reflecting on the power of that image and pick, somebody who would arrive at work, do heroin before their shift started, because people have these images of people that use substances are wholly dysfunctional, and that's wrong. They would arrive, they would use substance safely with us looking around, and then they would save lives all day long. Immersed in this trauma, immersed in this crisis, immersed in this community that's been left behind, yet still there with that courage to save their friends, And so I worked really collaboratively and alongside my peer colleagues to run these sites and manage them for I think about 4 years. And then one of the things that happened from that was realizing just the incredible depth of knowledge and innovation and creativity that these folks had. And so what we did is we worked together to create a training program called the Street Degree. And that did two things. On the one hand, it did provide peers with training that they wanted. But what was cooler was that it was training that peers would often give. So we would have, for example, instead of doing the typical first responders coming in, like police and ambulance talking about how to de-escalate or to do nonviolent crisis intervention, we had community members doing that and talking about the unique way they had to approach that. Because they have to do things differently, in a space like that. Because they're working with their own community, they have to think differently about, rolling up on somebody and saying, hey, you can't do that, or that's not cool, or I'm going to kick you out. They might be related to that person, or that person, they might owe that person money. There's all this really beautiful, interesting nuance there that reframed how we did this work. And so that got turned into the Street Degree. And then we went on to, after I left the Maple and Molson overdose prevention site, went on to have the opportunity to kind of take some of those ideas and turn them into a province-wide online training curriculum called Peer Connect to train peer support workers. And the cool thing about that, 100% of it was done with folks with lived experience. And for that course, that expanded a bit. It wasn't just necessarily, active substance users or people with experience of substance use. It was people with experience of a mental health diagnosis, or perhaps people that gender diverse folks that may have had experience navigating the, healthcare, Indigenous folks, everyone contributed to it and was really driven by folks with lived experience.
So I'm curious, with that radical transition when you were at Insight, and then all of a sudden now the number of overdoses is accelerating, the response to those overdoses is transitioning, and there is no blueprint on how to do this work. What does your personal lived experience, how does that support what you were doing in terms of creating the different, whether it's structures or processes? How did that show up for you?
The thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is patience. I think that we we primarily have to be patient with people who are undergoing these kinds of struggles. You and I were talking before we started recording about, like, we are dealing with multiple crises, overlapping crises, intersecting crises. And so the people we're trying to support in this, and I'm not just talking about people who are suffering from substance use disorder and are suffering from overdose, but also people that witness it and respond to it. It's hard, right? Because we want simple solutions, and we want to point to this one thing and say, just stop using drugs, just stop doing the thing that's harmful, or whatever it might be. We want to respond to chaos and disorder and our own personal lack of control with more control, with more laws and things like that. And I understand that. I really do understand that. But if we're to solve these things, we really have to do it all together. Like, it has to be together. And that includes everyone in the conversation. It includes the folks, that are worried about their kids on the playground. It has to include them. We all have to do this together, and we have to be patient, and we have to understand that it takes time. For example, I think one of the things that started the journey towards sobriety for me and recovery for me, and again, being clear that idea of recovery can look different for everyone and doesn't necessarily need to include sobriety at all. For me, it did, but one of the things that happened to me was I remember sitting at a bus stop at Main Street SkyTrain station and was just shattered, just like pretty profoundly alone and broken, and just sitting there, and everyone's going about their business as they should,
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's like running along with their groceries and getting on buses and, walking with their friends. And it was a guy pushing a shopping cart who pulled his shopping cart over to that bus stop and sat down right next to me and like waited a moment. He didn't say anything at first, and then he just asked me if I was okay. Like, just that, and it's those things. Like, it's not always going to be a new website. It's not going to be a new program. It's not going to be Narcan. It's not going to be government interventions. It's going to be this kindness that we have to bring to all these intersecting crises, and this understanding that because these problems affect all of us in different ways, whether that's the housing crisis or inequality, or any of the other crises that we're facing, that we have to solve because they affect us all. The solutions are gonna lie in us all coming together. And it's hard to take on the complexity of that work when you are, in communities like the one we're in right now. Often, people are witnessing a lot of trauma every day, stepping over people and seeing overdoses and sirens all day long. And the desire to want that to just stop and go away is a very understandable one. But these problems are complex, and it's a hard thing to say, but oftentimes when people are responding with understandable frustration and even intolerance, it's hard, but often they're arguing with the echoes of that response from people before them that wanted to push the problem down the road and say, I just want these people out of my neighborhood. I just don't want them in my alleyway. I just don't want to hear the sirens. I just want them in treatment. I want them in prison. I want them incarcerated. I want them involuntary, care or whatever it is. That simply guarantees that you or somebody like you will be having the same reaction 5-10 years from now. And so many of those problems are what we're dealing with, because we haven't come together and worked on them together to solve them together. And sometimes they may be crises that you don't feel like are impacting you. Like, why should I have a home, or why should I help with homelessness when I have a home? And it's for that reason. It's like, because you want a safe, happy community, and we're all part of this community, whether we have a home or not, whether we're suffering from an overdose or not, whether we're a substance user of illicit substances or not, or maybe we just use the legal ones. But these are problems we all have to work on together. So just to go back to your question, I really think a lot about that patience, because for folks struggling, it can be, I was joking about the linoleum, but I also wasn't. Like, it can be the tiniest barrier or sense that people might not care is going to shut the door, or I'm going to shut the door and I'm going to walk away from this opportunity to change my life. And this opportunity to maybe not be that burden that you're frustrated by now. You know, like who knows what I would be doing now if people hadn't been patient and kind with me. And maybe I'd be that person in your alleyway that you see as a problem if that kindness hadn't been available to me in so many different ways. Like,
yeah, well, when you talk about, the simplicity in a response or in connecting with somebody, on the one side, that can be the challenging part is how do you connect with someone so simple as asking them, how are you doing today?
Yeah.
Or creating those safe places. But then, you fast forward to you being a significant contributor to helping respond to the overdose crisis and having dealt yourself with over 300 overdoses and responding to that takes its toll on somebody. So being in the industry and now supporting others, what did that do to you personally when you were, consistently showing up and working through some of those challenges? And like I said, not having that sort of clear pathway or this is our process and protocols to follow.
Thinking back to the beginnings of the crisis, we really thought that it would be a temporary thing. We really thought that, just sort of connecting back to what we were just talking about, it's like we really thought that there would be a full court press, like that, municipal, provincial, federal governments would come with a comprehensive solution, and that didn't happen, and that was really difficult. But one of the things that's really hard is that when you have folks like myself that have lived experience and want to give back or want to help, whether organizations are conscious of this or not, they count on that, right? They count on people in healthcare and on the front lines to be those people. And so they push them. They put them through a lot, and they tell them that help is coming, that change is coming, when it isn't. And they don't often take the risks to be honest, and they don't often take the risks to take responsibility, like leadership in particular in management don't often take the risks to be open about what they're asking of you and what the limitations of what they are, what they can provide. And so that was like really hard. It's like, honestly, like the most consistent thing is that what they call emotional labor part. Like where you feel like you're not making a difference. It's like, responding to hundreds and hundreds of overdoses, yet they keep happening. You feel like nothing is changing. Maybe I'm not making a difference. Maybe I'm not helping people. And organizations are not good at helping their workers deal with that emotional labor and take that emotional labor off their plates and go, you are here, this is your job, this is who you are, this is how you are in the world, but it's not your job alone to solve the overdose crisis. You personally can't keep everyone alive. You can't push this rock up the hill. But that doesn't happen. Within that, it's hard, right? Because no one was, this is new. This isn't part of what healthcare used to look like. And it's unique, probably the overdoses crisis is intense everywhere, but it's certainly extraordinarily intense in British Columbia and in Vancouver. And so no one's prepared for this, and no one's prepared for the toll it takes on frontline workers. And there has to be some brave thinking about, can we even ask people to do these jobs for 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, 2 years? Is it rational and reasonable to say, hey, you're a mental health care worker, you're going to do this work for 5 years? Or should we be thinking about, we're going to give you a huge amount of training and support, and we're going to ask you to do this work, if you're well, for 2 years, and then you're not going to be able to do it? Because that's another big part when we're caring people, and this also becomes a trauma response, we keep going. Because one of the ways to keep that trauma at bay and that fear at bay is just to keep doing the thing. It's harder when you step away, and you and I talked about that before. It got really hard for me when I stepped away from the front lines. It was way harder. And so, having organizations recognize that and going, we love who you are. We love that you want to continue to help. You aren't allowed. You can't work on the front lines for past 2 years. It's just an idea I've been thinking about. Who knows if it's even doable, but it's that kind of thinking about, like, it's first principles thinking, right? It's like, stop thinking about what this used to look like, what should it look like, considering the function we're in, like, consider what we're trying to do, the problems we're trying to solve. We can't go about it the same way. It's going to need different supports.
And it's fascinating listening to you talk about, the opportunities that really the entire industry, radical transformation, but it's really radical creation. And I use that word radical when really it's just a different response than what has historically been done. So I'm curious, when we come back to your personal story here, you also, during this time when you were working on the front lines, you were going home each night to your family. And some of the other maybe peer support workers, they were still living in community, whether it's on the downtown east side or living in their active addiction. And so what and how does that, differentiate or take a toll in the way that the team and the community really shows up to solve this problem, as opposed to, solely relying or placing that onus on the individual?
Everyone's talking about self-care, and it annoys me. Because, community care, in my experience, has been a far more profound and effective way of dealing
Absolutely.
with. Yeah, it really has. And that's what we're doing right now. And that's especially one of the biggest things that peers brought to the work, was the power of connection and community. But you're absolutely right. What was being asked of peers was huge, right? Because, as you say, I could take a bus up the street and to a certain degree leave a lot of that crisis and emergency behind. Whereas, our peer workers that are still doing this work, and they would often, at the peak of the crisis, they would walk home and respond to overdoses. They would respond to overdoses in their building. They would constantly be doing this. And this connects back to, like, organizations having a duty of care to everyone on their teams, and to talking about how they're going to support and change, as you said, that radical creation. Like, what are they going to do differently? And one of the biggest challenges, and I'll be frank, was that the organizations that were working with peers did not do that. They absolutely took advantage of that, and they absolutely, They turned themselves in knots trying to, like, define what the peers were doing as, volunteering-ish. It's a return to work program. They would just tie themselves in knots to try and redefine it, because I don't even know why. I mean, that fear of, like, well, what does this look like? Without recognizing, as we were talking before, this is a completely different crisis. It's a different beast than we've ever faced before, and we need different tools for it. And the peers are probably the biggest, most effective tool in this, but we need to support them in things like supporting their desire for a union, for example, supporting their desire early on for vacation pay, for access to some form of counseling and benefits. And that's why we talk about these intersecting crises and stigma, right? Because you have somebody working within the overdose crisis, which everyone's focused on in the moment, but what the people in management and leadership didn't recognize is what you're implying there, is that the people doing this work, they're responding to the overdose crisis, but they're also part of the crisis of inequality. Many of them suffering intergenerational trauma as Indigenous folks as well. And what are you going to do about that in this moment? And how do you provide for them in this moment? And again, it's also the burden on the folks that weren't peers, because we would be tormented with. I was heartbroken about getting on that bus every day. It was hard. I have very strong memories of, like, hugging my friend Sean Giroux goodbye and watching him walk down Hastings, knowing what he was walking back into, and I get to get on the bus, get on my iPhone and watch a movie on the bus on the way home or whatever it was. And so it was hard. It was hard even that way. And that's that thing, that emotional labor. Like, what are the organizations doing to address this problem? You can't use these people and then not help them and support them. It isn't complicated, and it's weird how that gets right to the root of the overdose crisis. And that's like, we do think of people who use illicit substance differently. We value them less because there's no other way of explaining why that happens in those moments. There isn't I can't find a different, I've thought about it. And on some level, unconsciously, these organizations do see peers as less, or else this wouldn't be complicated. Yes, there's budgetary issues and things like that, but we found the budget to do things like create a street degree program because that looks good. We can sell that, we can put that in our annual report. We can, do a TikTok video about it. But like, it's just like, and it's still happening to these days. Like, we still making videos about peers and peers appearing in videos, but they're not paid the same as the person who organized the video, that works at the same organization as them and things like that. So it was hugely frustrating and traumatizing. And, it's important that organizations try to untangle themselves from the, I don't necessarily like this phrase because it's been weaponized, but virtue signaling stuff, right?
Yep.
The optics stuff, and go, what tangible material differences are we making for peers and the folks that work alongside them? What are those tangible material differences are they? Are we communicating them to our staff? Are these real? Not pilot projects. Don't promise stuff to people if you can't follow through on it. Here's the real things we're going to give you. Here's a plan for us to follow through on them. And here's what we're going to do if we aren't able to. So many organizations promise things, don't follow through on them, and never talk about that part about it. They'll promise 20 things, they'll deliver on one of them, and that will go in the report, not the 19 they didn't do.
Yeah.
And so untangling ourselves from that, the virtue signaling and the optics of it, and doing the real hard day-to-day work of materially changing what looks like for people and what real supports in the work looks like for people.
What I love about listening to you and understanding more about this issue is your authenticity, and understanding that, you're somebody who has taken your lived experience. You've then worked in the industry to create a better world for peers, for people who are in active addiction. And then, now you're continuing that journey. What I'm curious to learn a little bit more about is just how you utilized some of the different services and supports that were available to you, and kind of how, moving forward with some of this work on that provincial mobile response team, what other services are available that maybe you didn't know, what you had when you were working through some of these challenges?
It's a really good question, right? Because it's like, we can have all these big theories about all this stuff, but it's really, if there isn't something there for you to go to when you're ready, it doesn't mean anything, right? And I thought a lot about it, and I even at one point in early recovery was trying to count how many people had helped me get to recovery, and I lost count at hundreds. Like, we get caught up in this idea, it's like my story, or whoever, I did this, I did not do this. I did not do this. Like, a community did this. Real people out there right now, somebody out there right now is the person that answered the phone at Pacifica. That person that is that human being that decided to do this work and show up in the world that way, went to work one day, picked up the phone, and made a difference and contributed to me being here right now. And so some of the things that were available to me was addictions counselors. That's not quite the right substance. And anyway, they're available usually at your local health authority, clinic, drop-in clinic. They're so undersung, and they really are an incredibly powerful resource that can connect you, not just provide you with somebody to talk to and to hold you up, but to connect you to resources. So part of my story, for example, was I was so sick, and it was really bad. And I remember I was living with my parents because I'd burnt my life to the ground. And I remember one morning, and this is the longest walk of my life, walking from the spare bedroom to the phone going, I was going to call my addictions counselor, and I did. And I called him and I said, I don't know what to do. I really need help. I'll do anything. And he said, okay, I'm going to send your application off to Pacifica. And I said, my application to Pacifica, I haven't filled that out. And he's like, I did. I filled it out months ago, you know. And that's an emotional thing for me to talk about, because that's somebody who really saw me. And in the moment also allowed me choice and self-determination, knew that if they said, this is what you should do, here's the application, let's send it in now, it wasn't the right time. They knew that, they saw me, they had the experience to wait until that moment. And he literally faxed it in that afternoon. So those counselors were available to me. Pacifica was available to me. 12-step is a big part of my story. That was available to me. But then from Pacifica, there were things like Hope Bridges, which is still going and provides like, helps you think about what you might want to do for work. And sometimes it's just a place to be in early recovery too. It's like you're there with your friends and you're doing these weird things about, we did all these like personality type tests, which were pretty ridiculous, but honestly, like being there with people and having a place to be was important in early recovery. So yeah, like treatment and counselors and things like Hope Bridges. And of course, the thing I mentioned earlier, that program, which doesn't exist anymore, but the PHS program, the Addiction Supported Independent Living, there were so many people in programs that helped me. And this is why they go back to that patience, right? It takes time. There's, very few of those miraculous stories where somebody just does one, like goes to an AA meeting and they're fine forever, or goes to detox for a couple of nights and is fine forever. That's not common. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of time and a lot of different resources. And like I said, it takes those hundreds of people that are showing up to those jobs and seeing people, listening to people, being authentic with people and helping them. It takes time. But there were a lot of resources early on that helped me, a lot.
Well, and again, listening to your story, and although everybody else who's come in and, woven into your story and has helped you get to the place you are today, what I find so fascinating is the fact that you had those opportunities, but you also took those steps that you needed to take. And yes, every 2 steps forward is 1 step back, or however you want to, talk about your journey. But I'm curious, like, as somebody who's now working on the front lines and who, you might have a difficult day and you have some more resources and tools that you can process, what maybe you've been going through. But at a certain point, it does take its toll on you. Mm-hmm. And what do you have any sort of coping mechanisms that you use in a good way today to support you on your continued journey?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about coping mechanisms a lot, and it's funny. I just came from some work we were doing with the mobile response team, and it was interesting because a lot of the coping mechanisms and because we're all similar in many ways, they're similar. Like, people talk about being in nature, they talk about pets and animals, they talk about family and friends, they talk about food, they talk about all those things. But it was interesting because one of the workers talked about work. And, instantly the people near them sort of reached out and sort of, like they're a very close team, and they were kind of laughing about like, oh, this person's like immerses themselves in work. The implication being that that's not healthy. The implication being that you're just avoiding hard feelings and big feelings. And yes, you have to be careful about it. But if I'm being really honest with you, the thing that is the most helpful is work, is helping. It is. And I think we need to allow that to be one of those things. And it's often not. People are often sort of go, yes, your work is important, but, you got to have a bubble bath as well. Like, you got to, that doesn't work for me. It doesn't. Like that, it just doesn't. And I'm not being judgmental about it, but it just doesn't work for me. Learning works for me. Helping works for me. Connecting works for me, because going back to, addiction, it is a cliche, but it's absolutely true. The thing that was killing me and making me sick was isolation and loneliness and secretiveness and all that stuff. And so the things now that keep me healthy and happy are connection. And I get that through, I get it, absolutely, I get it through AA. AA is part of my story, continues to be, but I also get it through work and through doing as well. But also the other stuff, like music is hugely important for me. Walking is hugely important for me. I love walking. And there's lots of science to back that up about the stress hormone cortisol gets dissipated when we are in movement. And there's lots of, research that shows that walking in particular is very helpful for processing things. So walking is huge, music is huge, my pet. So some of the same
that was an easy one for you.
Some of the same things for sure, and my family and my friends. But I did want to do that thing because it's like, I think often people are looking for that answer. Like they're like, okay, Jonathan, it's all the doing, but what else is there? But honestly, it is the doing. And it does make me feel good. And although there have been serious effects to my health from this, it's still worth it. I have PTSD definitely shows up in my body in lots of different ways. And, it sucks. It's not the greatest. But I feel better when I'm helping and doing. And again, like, to be clear, it's not like, so first of all, that's not something that will work for everyone, but it works for me, and it's not expected of people. Everyone will have their ways of doing it. And just to be clear, that I'm supported in that action. Like I can go and do that because of my family, because of my wife, because of my son, and because of my friends and family. It's not just me shouldering it up alone. It's that, and that's that community care part.
And also too, I know that you're somebody who has gotten into this work really wanting to make a difference. And I think so many of our listeners, the reason why they get into supporting others, being in the healthcare industry, is because they want to make a difference and they genuinely care. And it's sometimes, as you alluded to earlier, when you're consistently in the trenches doing the work, sometimes, that can be difficult to remind yourself. And so having that care plan, having the ability to turn to those healthy outlets, and it's going to be different for everybody. It's something that I know, we've heard consistently on the show here. And I feel like it's coming back to humanizing, the individual.
Doing this work, it's continually rehumanizing me and continually bringing me back to those human gestures, those small things. It's an immense privilege to sit with people and hear those stories. And because it's hopeful, it's very hopeful to see these people who all do look different and come from different experiences, different than me, all working as a team to care and support and love people. And they're there sharing that work with me. It's amazing, and it really does humanize things and makes me hopeful. Like, we hear a lot about inhumanity these days, but it's the caring humans are the norm. Absolutely, they are.
Well, Jonathan, it's been such a privilege today for myself to be able to sit with you, to have this conversation. And, the more that I continue to be able to ask you some of these questions and learn from you, the more that I know that there's more work that needs to be done. It's very clear, your experience, your ability to take complex situations and scenarios and really just distill them into, again, those humanizing moments is where, personally, I, raise my hands and give you all the accolades that, you deserve in terms of what you've gone through, where you've come to, and, where you will continue to go towards. So as we wrap up here, a question that I love to ask every one of our guests are, if somebody was struggling today, what is that one piece of advice? What is that one thing that you might support them with, reach out, connect them with? How would you be responding?
I think it's two things, really. I think it's, again, it's always the same thing. It's reach out. Be human, reach out. But underneath that, it's like, what are you, like, look very closely at what you're scared of, because that's where the help is. Like, the thing that you're scared of, that's the path. It's almost always there, and for me that was fear of my own humanity. It was fear of other people. It was fear of connection, but it was also the thing that saved me, and it was also precisely the thing that I needed. So reach out, and if you can, think about what it is that's holding you back and what you might be afraid of, because there's probably some answers in there.
Getting comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Certainly something that I feel, so many of us continue to work with and towards, but everything that you said today, we're really grateful for your experience and your knowledge. So thank you so much for being part of this show and for all the great work that you're continuing to do.
Thank you so much. It was such fun and such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Be sure to visit the links in the show notes for resources and supports from the Care for Caregivers program. If you're interested in sharing your story on the Care2Listen podcast, please reach out to us at careforcaregivers.ca/podcasts. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform to be notified when new episodes are released. Thanks again for joining us, and see you next month.